Welcome to week 12 of Political Science 101. This week, we turn to the most visible, most scrutinized job in the entire government, the presidency. When Americans picture their government, they usually picture the president first. But the office is far more complex and in some ways more limited than it appears on television. This week, we'll look at how the presidency was designed, how a president gets elected, and the many roles they play, the huge team that supports them, and the real tools of presidential power. Throughout, I'll keep this nonpartisan. Our focus is the office itself, not any particular president. As always, I'll define the key terms as we go and review them at the end. And I'll say a special keyword aloud that you'll need to unlock the lecture quiz. So let's begin. Here's our plan. First, we'll look at the founders and how they designed the presidency. Deliberately powerful, but carefully checked. Second, we'll cover how presidents are chosen and the many different roles or hats that they wear. Third, we'll meet the enormous team that helps a president govern. And fourth, we'll examine the real tools of presidential power from executive orders to the art of going public. There are 13 key terms this week, a slightly shorter list, which gives us room to really understand the office. Let's start at the beginning. How did the founders design this office and what did they fear? One reason the presidency is so demanding is that it's really many jobs rolled into one person. Let's look at the main hats a president wears. As chief executive, the president runs the entire executive branch and is responsible for enforcing the nation's laws, a huge management job over millions of federal employees. As commander-in-chief, the president is the civilian head of the entire United States military, a deliberate choice by the founders to keep the armed forces under civilian control. As chief diplomat, the president is the nation's main representative in foreign affairs, negotiating with other countries and shaping foreign policy. And as head of state, the president serves as the ceremonial symbol of the whole nation, the role a king or queen plays in other countries. There's more. The president also acts as a chief legislature by proposing an agenda and signing or vetoing bills. But these four capture how many distinct roles land on one desk. It's genuinely one of the hardest jobs in the world. It's worth pausing on how unusual it is that all these hats sit on one person. In many other democracies, these roles are split. A country might have a prime minister who runs the government and a separate king, queen, or ceremonial president who serves as a symbolic head of state. The United States rolled both into one office, which is part of why a single scandal or success can feel so enormous. The same person is both the working chief executive and the living symbol of the nation. When a president travels abroad or throws out a first pitch, that's the head of state hat. When they fire an official or direct an agency, that's the chief executive hat. Founders wanted a president strong enough to act decisively, but they were terrified of creating a king. So they built in limits. One is term limits. Thanks to the 22nd Amendment, added after Franklin Roosevelt won 4 elections, a president can serve a maximum of 2 4-year terms. The other, ultimate check, is impeachment. Impeachment is the formal process of charging a high official, including the president, with serious wrongdoing, what the Constitution calls high crimes and misdemeanors. Here's the part people often get wrong. Impeachment is only the charge made by the House of Representatives. It's like an indictment. It does not itself remove anyone. After the House impeaches, the Senate holds a trial, and it takes a 2/3 Senate vote to actually convict and remove the president. That's a very high bar, and in fact, no U.S. president has ever been removed from office through this process. It's the constitutional emergency brake, rarely used and even more rarely successful. Let me add one clarification students often want because impeachment gets talked about loosely in the news. Being impeached is not the same thing as being removed, and it isn't necessarily the end of a presidency. Because removal requires that very high 2/3 Senate bar, a president can be impeached by the House and then acquitted by the Senate, and remain in office. So when you hear that a president was impeached, the accurate reading is that the House formally charged them, not that they were kicked out. One more piece of the design worth knowing is presidential succession. If a president dies, resigns, or is removed, the vice president steps up, which is why the vice presidency, often mocked as a do-nothing job, is one heartbeat from the most powerful office on earth. The 25th Amendment spells out this line of succession and even lays out procedures for what happens if a president becomes unable to do the job. Here's one of the most important themes in the chapter. The presidency today is far more powerful than the office the founders sketched in 1787. Article 2 of the Constitution actually describes the president's powers only briefly and somewhat vaguely. So, how did the office grow so much? Several reasons. Congress has repeatedly delegated authority to the president, especially over budgets and war. National crises, wars, depressions, emergencies have consistently expanded presidential power because the country looks to one person to act fast. And modern media, first radio and television, now the internet, gave presidents a direct line to the public that no member of Congress can match. I want to be even-handed here. People genuinely disagree about whether this growth is good or bad. Some argue a strong, energetic executive is necessary to govern a large modern nation. Others worry that an ever more powerful presidency threatens the balance of powers the founders designed. That debate over the proper limits of presidential power runs through everything else in this chapter. A helpful way to hold this fairly is to notice that people's views on presidential power often shift depending on who holds the office. When your preferred party controls the White House, a strong, decisive president can look like effective leadership. When the other party is in charge, that very same power can look alarming. That's human nature, but it's worth catching in yourself because the powers of the office outlast any one occupant. The honest question isn't whether you like the current president, but how much power you'd be comfortable handing to any president, including one you strongly oppose. That's the test the founders were wrestling with. So, how does someone actually become president, and what changed over the centuries? The way we nominate presidential candidates has changed dramatically, and one old key term marks the starting point: the King Caucus. In the early 1800s, presidential nominees were chosen by the King Caucus, an informal meeting of a party's members of Congress who got together and simply picked their party's nominee themselves. Notice the problem. This kept the choice in the hands of a small group of Washington insiders, with ordinary voters shut out entirely. Over time, this was seen as undemocratic, and it gave way first to national party conventions and eventually to the system of primaries and caucuses we studied back in the elections chapter, where voters themselves have a say. And of course, once nominated and elected, the winner is formally chosen by the Electoral College, another concept from Chapter 7. So the story of presidential selection is a slow story of opening up the process from insiders picking the nominee to the people having a direct vote. There's a nice irony worth appreciating here. The King Caucus got its mocking nickname precisely because critics thought it made party leaders in Congress into something like kingmakers, quietly anointing the next president in a back room. The reforms that followed, conventions and then primaries, were each attempts to pry that power out of insider hands and hand more of it to ordinary party members and voters. It's a good reminder that the rules for choosing our leaders aren't fixed or sacred. They've been rewritten repeatedly, usually in the direction of including more people. No one governs alone. Let's meet the team around the president. The president sits atop a vast organization, and three key terms describe the inner circle. The cabinet is the group of top advisors who each lead one of the 15 executive departments, like the Departments of State, Defense, or the Treasury. They're the president's senior advisors for their areas. Surrounding the president even more closely is the Executive Office of the President, or EOP, the cluster of offices and staff that report directly to the president and is headed by the White House Chief of Staff. The EOP is the president's personal command center. And one especially powerful office within it is the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, which prepares the president's annual budget proposal and helps oversee the entire federal bureaucracy. Controlling the budget process gives OMB enormous influence over what the government actually does. Together, these make up the core of the modern presidential team. It's worth grasping the sheer scale here, because it shapes how the presidency actually works. The president cannot personally run millions of federal employees or master every issue. So in practice, they lead through their team, setting direction and relying on cabinet secretaries and staff to carry it out. That's a source of power, since a good team multiplies what a president can do. But it's also a limit because a president depends on other people to actually execute their wishes, and those people don't always move as fast or as faithfully as the president wants. The presidency is less a single person pulling levers than one person steering a giant organization. Now, the heart of the matter. What power does a president actually have and how do they use it? Some of a president's most talked about powers let them act on their own without waiting for Congress. An executive order is a directive the president issues that has the force of law, no congressional vote required. Executive orders are powerful and immediate, but they have a catch. Because the president made them, the next president can simply undo them. So they lack the permanence of a real law. In foreign affairs, presidents often use an executive agreement, a deal with another country made directly by the executive branch without needing the Senate approval that a formal treaty requires. It's faster, but also narrower and less durable than a treaty. And a signing statement is a written comment a president attaches when signing a bill into law, stating how they interpret it or intend to enforce it. All three are ways presidents act unilaterally, and all three are debated because they let the president shape policy while sidestepping the slower work of Congress. Here's the trade off at the center of all of these unilateral loopholes, or tools, and it's genuinely double edged. On one hand, they let a president act quickly and decisively, which can be exactly what's needed when Congress is deadlocked. On the other hand, because they bypass the slow, deliberate lawmaking process we studied last week, critics worry they let a president make big policy changes without the broad agreement a real law requires. And because the next president can reverse an executive order with the stroke of a pen, policy made this way can swing back and forth every time the White House changes hands. Both the appeal and the danger come from the same source: speed without consensus. Presidents also have tools to block and to withhold. The most familiar is the veto, the power to reject a bill Congress has passed. Congress can override a veto, but only with a difficult two-thirds vote in both chambers. In the 1990s, Congress tried to give the president a sharper tool, the line item veto, which would have let the president cancel specific individual items in a spending bill while approving the rest. But the Supreme Court struck it down in 1998 as unconstitutional. So presidents don't have it today, though it remains a classic exam term. A very different tool is executive privilege, the president's claimed right to keep certain information, especially private advice and national security matters, secret from Congress, the courts, and the public. Executive privilege isn't written in the Constitution, it's implied, and its limits are frequently fought over. Because it pits the president's need for confidentiality against the public's and Congress's need to know. The veto itself is worth appreciating as a check that flows the other direction. We spent last week seeing how Congress checks the president, but the veto is a major way the president checks Congress. Even a bill that passed both chambers can be stopped by a single presidential refusal to sign. The threat of a veto alone often shapes legislation, because Congress will adjust a bill to avoid one, and the override requirement, a two-thirds vote in both chambers, is deliberately hard, so a determined president can usually make a veto stick. It's a clean example of the checks and balances we've traced all semester, working in both directions at once. A president's power isn't only formal. A huge part of it is persuasion, especially persuading the public. Teddy Roosevelt captured this with a famous phrase, the bully pulpit. In his day, bully meant terrific, and he meant the presidency is a terrific platform, a stage from which the president can command attention and push an agenda like no one else. A specific modern strategy built on this is called going public. Going public is when a president delivers a major national address over the heads of Congress directly to the people, hoping that public pressure will push their legislatures to support what the president wants. And presidents get a natural boost in one particular situation, described by the rally around the flag effect. During an international crisis or the start of a war, a president's approval typically spikes as citizens unite behind their leader. The lecture keyword today is bourbon. Bourbon. Again, the keyword today is bourbon. Bourbon. This is a nod to Kentucky's Bourbon Trail heritage. You must enter this in your Week 12 lecture quiz to get credit. But that boost is usually temporary, and history shows presidents are actually quite limited on their ability to move public opinion over the long run. The bully pulpit is real, but it's not magic. Here's why that limit matters, and it ties back to our public opinion chapter. Presidents have the loudest megaphone in the country, so you'd think they could talk the public into almost anything. But the research is humbling. People mostly filter presidential appeals through the party and beliefs that they already hold. A president can rally their own supporters and briefly focus the nation's attention, but genuinely converting opponents is rare. So going public is less a mind control ray and more a way to energize people already inclined to agree, and to raise the visibility of an issue. Let's step back. The presidency is the office Americans watch most closely, and it's easy to imagine the president can simply do whatever they want. But the deepest lesson of this chapter is the opposite. The president is powerful but genuinely checked by Congress, by the courts, by the Constitution, by public opinion, and by the next election. As a citizen, your job is to understand those real powers and those real limits so you can hold any president of any party accountable to them. An informed public that knows the difference between what a president can and cannot legitimately do is itself one of the most important checks of all. That clear eyed understanding, not cynicism, and not blind trust, is exactly what this course is trying to build in you. And notice how this chapter connects to everything before it. The president checks Congress with a veto. Congress checks the president with impeachment, the power of the purse, and oversight. The courts can strike down executive actions, as they did the line item veto, and the people check the president through elections and public opinion. No single one of these is decisive on its own, but woven together they form the web of accountability the founders were after. The presidency is enormously powerful, but it sits inside that web and not above it. Before we wrap up, let's gather the key terms. There are 13 this week, split across 2 slides, so pause on these or screenshot them to study. This first set covers the check of impeachment, how nominees were once chosen, and the president's team, the cabinet, the executive office, and the budget office, plus the first of the direct action tools. And the second set covers the rest of the president's toolkit, signing statements, the line item veto, executive privilege, and the persuasion tools, the bully pulpit, going public, and the rally around the flag effect. When you take this week's quiz, this is the definitions and terms that I'll want you to know. Let's pull Chapter 12 together into 3 big ideas. 1. The founders designed a single energetic president, but hedged the office with checks like term limits and impeachment, fearing a return to monarchy. 2. Over 2 centuries, presidential power has grown well beyond the Constitution's brief description, through crises, delegated authority, and the media, which is a real and ongoing debate. And 3. Presidents govern with a large team and a toolkit of powers, executive orders, executive agreements, the veto, executive privilege, and the bully pulpit, yet remain limited, especially in their ability to move public opinion and to act without the other branches. Here's what's due this week. Week 12 runs Monday, November 2nd through Sunday, November 8th. First, read Chapter 12 in your textbook and use the 2 key term slides here to study. Second, finish watching this lecture. Third, take the Week 12 lecture quiz and use the keyword I said earlier. And fourth, this is a discussion week, so complete the Week 12 discussion board. Post your response, then reply to at least 2 classmates. Work through them in order and complete at least 1 activity so the system records your attendance. That's Chapter 12, the presidency, the most visible and most demanding office in American government, and one that is powerful yet carefully checked. If questions come up, email me at hwelch@unionky.edu and I'll reply within 24 to 48 hours. Great work this week, and next time we'll tackle Chapter 13, the courts.